I knew that I had an affiliation with Akhenaten, who the Egyptologists were saying was Tutankhamun's father. But that wasn't resonating with me. It's like, no, he's not. And then every time I read a book on Egypt, I would going, this isn't true. This isn't true. There was so much stuff in there that just was made up. And yet all the Egyptologists believed it. So as an 11-year-old, who are people going to listen to? An 11-year-old who says the pyramids were never tombs, the pyramids were a giant battery, that there's more stuff under the ground there that hasn't been discovered. And I thought I must be wrong. And it never went away. And so then I started looking for the proof about Egypt. And of course, when I was younger, I couldn't really do that because I was involved in other things. But I still had this incredible thing going on. But I became very aware that there were two streams of Egyptian priests. There was a very corrupt stream, and then there was a stream that held the sacred truths. And they were very much underground. And it was the corrupt priests that ran everything. The first time I saw a picture of Akhenaten, I knew that Akhenaten was not human, that he was part of another race, of an extraterrestrial race that had come here, and that the whole history of Egypt was wrong. So I had to find the physical proof that could prove that all of the Egyptologists were wrong in their datings. And I found it, and it's really simple. The whole Egyptian dating is based on a document written by a Greek called Manetho in around 400 BC, who went to Egypt to document the history of Egypt. He came there and found that they were talking about rulers that ruled for 20,000 years and a civilization that went back hundreds of thousands of years. And that was totally at odds with what the Greeks believed. The Greeks believed the world was only 5,000 years old. So when Manetho went there, there was a total mismatch. So rather than extend the Greek concept of life, he forced the Egyptian chronology into the Greek time frame and said, well, the Zep Tepi, the first time where all of the gods ruled Egypt, we'll just consider that to be myth. And we're only going to date it from this particular time of Menes, who was the first human pharaoh. So he dated everything from there. Now the interesting thing about that document is even that doesn't add up time-wise, because there's all these missing things. And that document doesn't exist anymore. No, there's no cross-referencing of that document. What exists is 3 documents that are written from that were written around about 200, I think, 200 AD. So 600 years later, there are 3 documents which have differences in them, but all Egyptologists base the history of Egypt on those 3 documents. So the whole history of Egypt is based on a false premise. And the Egyptologists either won't acknowledge that or don't acknowledge it. And there's a very strong reason why. They've all gone to university for all of this time to get professorships, all based on that. So for somebody to come out and contradict it means destroying the whole basis of that very science, if you want to call it a science. So that they will not accept anyone who is not an Egyptologist, because they're not experienced, they're not qualified to do that. So that's why the documentation of Egypt is wrong. The next thing about Egypt is the physical evidence. So anyone who looks at the physical evidence will tell you that that couldn't have possibly been built by humans. There's no way known that that could have been happened. How do you move 2.3 million blocks that weigh anything from 2 to 10 tons? And they've done a check on it and said, well, if they had all the population of Egypt working 7 days a week, 10 hours a day during the day, it would take them 20 years to build that. But the Egyptologists will tell you, oh no, but they didn't work 12 months of the year because they were actually having to do farming for 9 months of the year, so they only worked 3 months of the year. So suddenly when you start to work out how often they're having to put one of these 2 to 10 ton blocks in place, they were having to put them in one every 2 seconds. One every 2 seconds. It's crazy. This is what the Egyptologists will tell you. When you start to pull apart the story and you do the time frames, it just doesn't make sense. So the evidence is compelling that there was some sort of civilization going there, and in fact going back hundreds of thousands of years. So I became very, very aware of that. And eventually my journey took me to Egypt, and in particular when I was around red granite. Because red granite is a sign of the older civilizations. There's 3 distinct layers that you can see there. There's huge evidence of there being a giant tsunami that went up the Nile, which obliterated temples. And you'll find temples that are buried in anything from 20 to 50 feet of silt. And they try to tell you that that silt has been laid down progressively over thousands of years. Well, how does a temple that might get 3 inches of silt laid down in a flood one year not get cleared away by the population so they can use the temple again? They just leave it, and then the next year another inch floods it, and they don't clear it away to use the temple again. They just go, no, let's just let the temple get slowly covered in silt by an inch a year. Doesn't make sense. It does make sense the whole thing was covered in a tsunami, and there is specific evidence that will prove that, and that's to do with the Santorini volcanic eruption around 1600. But before that, there were all of these temples made of polished red granite. We don't have the technology to be able to cut 10-ton blocks of red granite and polish them to the accuracy that they have. We just don't have the technology to build these temples. So someone who had a great technology did, and it was way before we came on the scene. Humans didn't build these things. So Egypt sort of pulled me back to find out the real truth of what was under the sand. And in the process of that, I connected with a number of people who were doing some scans of certain areas. They were trying to get to certain places in the back door without raising the awareness of the Supreme Council of the Antiquities. Now, that's a very corrupt body, of which Zahi Hawass is the head. He is a member of the Illuminati. He's become incredibly rich by robbing these temples and taking artifacts out of them for the purpose of the Illuminati. And I can back that up because in 2010, in April, there were some colleagues of mine who were on the rooftop of a hotel overlooking the area of the Sphinx and the Giza Plateau. They heard an explosion in the compound. They turned their cameras into the compound, and they witnessed in the middle of the night tractors removing large sarcophaguses and statues from underground of the Giza Plateau. Now, why would you do these things in the middle of the night? And why has there been no disclosure from the Egyptian government about the discovery of these things? Because they're robbing them, and this is what they've been doing systematically. Whenever they find a location, they shut it off to the population. It becomes a military site. The whole Giza Plateau is a military site. It's not a world classified area. It's an area that is controlled by the Egyptian military. Because there are things underground there that they don't want you and I to know about. There are ancient technologies, all sorts of things there. It's a massive underground complex. The people that I've been involved with, and I have in my possession, a ground-penetrating radar scan of the Giza Plateau, which shows at least 9 chambers under the Giza Plateau that the Egyptian government are not telling people about. I have another scan of a location about 100 miles south, which is the famed location of the labyrinth. The labyrinth talked about by Manetho, which has hundreds and thousands of rooms in it, that contains all sorts of technology, knowledge, astronomical charts, and the bodies of the gods that created the human race. This is according to Manetho. And I have a scan showing the ground underneath. This is about 10, 12 metres below the ground, which shows this catacomb of rooms. And the Egyptian government are not releasing this information. And that's just 2 examples. So why are they not releasing it? Because they want to be able to get in there first and rob it, to take out of it what they want, and then Zahiwas will come forward and say, oh, look, we found this new tomb, but it's been robbed in the past. And he's not lying, it has been robbed in the past, but not in the distant past. It's been robbed in the last couple of years by him. And that's what's going on in Egypt. The whole thing about Mubarak, who was Illuminati, the whole rebellion was caused by them. They created it because they needed a distraction. They needed to get all of the foreigners out of Egypt, and they needed to get all the cameras away from the Giza Plateau, and they needed to be able to have a justification for putting more military around the Giza Plateau. So they created this distraction about an uprising so that they could go in and take the bigger things out of the ground without anyone knowing. And that's what the whole January uprising was really about. So there's stuff going on, and people think that it's the people rising up. No. The people are being controlled to do these sorts of things because they want you to look here while they're doing something over here they don't want you to know about, which was the whole building of the Aswan Dam, both of them. They built the Aswan Dam purely so that they could have all of this machinery around and they could shift all of these temples and save them. But what they were really doing was going into the temples and removing all of the stuff out of it. But they needed a cover story. So that's what the cover story was. And this goes on all the way through the American Civil War, all to do with cotton and all manipulation, all of these things. You can find huge examples of it. They've been systematically robbing these things for thousands of years. But they can only get to what they can get to with their technologies. So, of course, thousands of years ago, they could only get into some of the surface area and they weren't really aware of a lot of the spaces underground. But now with ground penetrating radar and satellite scans, they can locate every single location in Egypt where these places are. And a lot of them, they're locating them because many of these places have energy sources in them, like free energy generators. And so they show up as these flashes on the scale. So they use the American CIA satellites, because the CIA is the Illuminati. So they're using these satellites to scan Egypt to find the locations of all of this. And then it's a matter of, okay, we're going to seal off this area and systematically go through and rob them. And that's what they do. They find numerous things. They'll find what we would term alien technologies, energy sources, and some of these are often depicted on the walls in some of the tombs. For instance, at Dendra, they have this massive, big, looks like a cathode tube, which they've used to light things and do things. So they're after the technologies. The reason they're after the technologies is because they don't want us to have it, because they want to exploit us. And if we had free technologies, they couldn't exploit us. So they don't want us to have it, so they keep it to themselves. They're also very tied into the occult and symbolism. So they want all of the statues and everything. They're also they want the gold, because the gold is useful to them to convert into monoatomic gold. So they're the things that they want, and they don't want us to have them. I think it was 2003 or 2004, scientists discovered that when you put a particular process to gold and you heat it in a particular way, that instead of gold having the normal crystalline structure that it has, it would form monatomic lines of gold. And that when it was in that form, which was a white powder, it had incredible superconductivity and anti-gravitational, and it had all of these amazing effects. And incidentally, that when you ate it, that it created heightened levels of awareness and prolonged life. And when you go back and you read things like the Bible and the Quran and all this, they talk about the manna as being a white powder, that this powder that they ate, that they would make into bread and eat, which would give them long life and give them heightened levels of awareness. So this comes from sort of the Anunnaki that was their purpose of mining gold, was because that they could convert it into monoatomic gold. And there's various things you can read on the net that say, oh, it doesn't work, you shouldn't eat it, and all of that. Well, the Illuminati don't want everybody to know that they can get monoatomic gold and eat it and become heightened awareness. So they create all this misinformation about it. So that's what monoatomic gold is about.